First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. Clearly, I'm out of touch with the traditions at 5 by 15, so I don't have any notes. In the early days, that was a terrifying thing about doing 5 by 15, and every time Rosie Boycott asked me to do one of them, I would, panic and freeze and eventually drag myself here. I'm going to talk to you about T.S. Eliot. I could have chosen, when offered to speak about an English heritage blue plaque, many figures. I could have chosen Hendrix and Handel in Soho, lived in the same house, a couple of 100 years apart, but united by music. I could have chosen black composers, many different figures, but I chose T.S. for one very simple reason. This is the 100th anniversary of the publication in book form of The Wasteland. I was asked by a friend last year to do a reading of The Wasteland. I said, foolishly, yes. Began to read it and thought, this is a difficult poem to read out from a book. The meter is so perfect that if you stumble and try and find your place in the book, you'll get lost. So on holiday, I began to learn it by heart. I thought it was the only thing I could do, the only sensible way to deal with this problem. And as I learned it, and began to unpick and unpack this great poem, one of the longest poems in the English language, and one of the most influential, many questions began to occur to me, and I'll share one of the key ones. But first of all, T.S. Eliot Blue Plaque, 2 addresses, many addresses. He lived in London, many houses. He moved a lot. But there are 2 famous addresses associated with him. One, uncharacteristically, and not surprisingly, is 1 Homer Row. Now, people who love poetry would wonder if T.S. Eliot deliberately chose that address. Eliot, Homer. And the other is 3 Kensington Church Gardens in Kensington. Both of them happen to be in my general neighborhood. I'm extending the word neighborhood generously here. And every now and again, I entertain the fantasy that I could go round to T.S. Eliot's house and have a drink or tea and wonder how he would receive me. But taking you back to learning T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. So I began to learn it. And every day at home, I'd pick the poem up, read it out aloud. And after about the 15th time, when I began the poem, my daughter, who's 7 years old, finished the first verse. And I thought to myself, well, if my daughter, who is 6, can finish the first verse before I've learned it, I might be able to do the same thing. So we now have this thing where I do this reading. I've read it in 3 different places: London Library, Marylebone Theatre, and at the Wimbledon Literary Theatre, sponsored by the Wimbledon Philosophical Society. Different readings each time. I wanted to have dance and music. But the T.S. Eliot Society is very strict about T.S. Eliot. You're not allowed to have any movement, any music to T.S. Eliot's words. So as long as you're saying the words, nobody can move on stage apart from you. And there can be no music. I love the rigor of that. So we had the music and the dance in between the big sections. I'm aware of the poignancy of the first section of The Wasteland in the world we're in today, where there's war in Ukraine and the Middle East. It's a time of tragedy. and sadness. And the first section is called The Burial of the Dead. April. Originally it was February. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. I discovered that beginning with April was one of T.S. Eliot's great techniques, because he was going back in choosing April to the beginning of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. If you read the prologue, it begins with April and the cruelty, the celebration of spring, which T.S. Eliot inverts. This is T.S. Eliot. Every line, I discovered, has beneath it the entire history of English literature and indeed Western literature. Winter kept us warm, covering earth with forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Stambegese with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Binga keiner Russin stamm aus Litauen echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in winter. T.S. Eliot came to London as a young man. He came ostensibly to study philosophy. By the time he arrived in London, he'd already written those great early poems. He came to London and met the Bloomsbury crowd, Virginia Woolf, met people like Yeats, Ezra Pound. His marriage, as everybody knows, was difficult. And out of the difficulty of his marriage, the difficulty of his life in those early stages, along with what was going on in the Western world, the wars raging, out of all of this came what he called a grumble in verse. T.S. Eliot was a man of masks, of guises. Virginia Woolf, talking about a visit that T.S. Eliot paid them one day, noticed that he had rouge on his face, and that sometimes he had a little lipstick. He cultivated the pose of a perfect gentleman. But at the same time, in the publishing house where he worked later on, Faber and Faber, he was known as a bit of a practical joker. And during board meetings, he was known to actually arrange a firecracker underneath the chair of Mr. Faber, which would go off at an appropriate moment. T.S. Eliot. This is the question I ask myself about Mr. Eliot. Is there a black dimension to T.S. Eliot, who is already quite infamous in many literary circles for the anti-Semitism shown in his early poems? An anti-Semitism, I may add, which he regretted later in life, but he did not change those poems. Is there a black dimension? I kept asking myself this question. Why am I interested in this geezer? Why am I giving readings of this poem? Why does this poem fascinate me so much? I found myself in the States not that long ago, and there was a T.S. Eliot conference, and attended a lecture by Anita Patterson, and it was very striking. And this is what she had to say. She talked about something called synthetic homage, a concept invented by someone called Ed Pavlich. Ed Pavlich was elaborating on a concept in the famous black African-American critic called Gates. Synthetic, not synthetic, synthetic homage is a kind of reading whereby a text illuminates previously unsuspected, suppressed aspects of another text. African-American artists of the Harlem Renaissance period, some of them began to develop an interest in T.S. Eliot. And as it came about, people who studied this interest discovered that underneath the texts that were cut out by Ezra Pound from The Wasteland were the following things, very interesting. First of all, a secret reference and a kind of affinity with Coleridge, particularly the Coleridge of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which, if you know your William Empson, is also being read as a text about colonial and slavery guilt. That really hit me the first time I encountered that thought. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, my favorite poem, one of my favorite English poems. Man wears this albatross round his neck, weighed down by it. I always thought it was just a thing about awfulness and the wickedness of killing nature and birds. And no, it turns out it's a great symbol for another great weight that the nation had round its neck. And it's there, through Whittier, it enters into T.S. Eliot. Synthetic homage. The other thing that struck me, looking at T.S. Eliot's work, is his fascination with ragtime, with jazz. He was also a great dancer. He loved dancing. The thought of T.S. Eliot dancing boggles the mind a little bit. But apparently he really did love dancing. And there's a phrase in The Wasteland where he says, oh, that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. So, the other quality that struck me about The Wasteland are the play, the relay of voices. Many voices, voices of the street, voices of women, voices of men, voices of the Fisher King, voices, voices, voices. And where are these voices, this relay of voices coming from? It's also the great jazz tradition, the great call and response. So as it turns out, there is a buried tradition because T.S. Eliot lived in St. Louis, was born there, and he lived in a kind of a rough neighborhood. It was not the most genteel part of St. Louis, and just bordering it was a whole black neighborhood. These elements don't come through in his general biography and when you talk about T.S. Eliot. And then there's that phrase in the Four Quartet where he talks about a ship with its cargo of dead Negroes. With T.S. Eliot, one little reference carries a whole underworld of themes and suggested things. I've just been given a sign I've got 2 minutes. I could go on for a very long time about Mr. Eliot, but I'm going to end with the last verse of the first section. Unreal city. It's London he's talking about. Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the bridge and down King William Street to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hour with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There I saw someone I knew and stopped him, crying, "Stetson, you who were with me on the ships at Miley, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year, or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence at his friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You hypocrite lecteur on some blab, mon frère." That phrase, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout again, haunts me in this hour when so many corpses are not being buried across the world. Thank you very much.